There's something eerie about a locked door that refuses to stay locked, or a room that's never been part of the house's blueprints. I had heard stories like this before, of doors that opened when no one was near them, or of rooms that seemed to change their location overnight. But I never truly believed in those stories until I encountered it myself. It all started with an old house I moved into. It was a quaint, two-story place on the edge of town, the kind of house that seemed perfectly normal at first glance. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the architecture, it was charming, if a little outdated, but the house had a history, and I could feel it in every creak of the floorboards. I had been looking for a new place to call home, and this one seemed to be a great deal. It was affordable and had plenty of space. The realtor had been eager to show it to me, almost too eager, and when I asked about the previous owners, she hesitated before mentioning that the house had been vacant for several years. She assured me there were no issues, just that the owners had moved away, and no one had been interested in buying it until recently. I should have asked more questions, but I was eager to move in and didn't think much of it. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, settled into my new space, and explored the house, familiarizing myself with every room. It was on the third day that I noticed the door. It was in the hallway upstairs, a small door at the end of a narrow passageway that I hadn't noticed before. It looked like it had been there forever, but something about it struck me as strange. It didn't match the rest of the doors in the house. There was no doorknob, only an old-fashioned lock, the kind you'd expect to see on a chest or an attic door. I figured it was just an old storage closet, maybe something that had been sealed off over the years. I didn't think much of it at first, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached for the lock, expecting it to be rusty or stuck, but it turned easily, as if it hadn't been locked in years. I opened the door, half expecting to find a small, dusty closet, but instead I was met with nothing but darkness. The room beyond the door was completely black, as if the very air inside had swallowed up any light. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should go in. But then I felt a strange pull, an undeniable compulsion to step forward. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The room felt strange, as though it didn't quite belong to the house. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust, and the air felt stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. There was nothing in the room, no furniture, no windows, just an empty space that seemed to stretch out endlessly, but something didn't feel right. It was as though the room was too perfect, too empty. I didn't know why, but I had the overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't be there. I quickly left, closing the door behind me. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but something about the room felt off, like it wasn't supposed to exist. I thought I had imagined the whole thing, but over the next few days I found myself drawn to that door again. Every time I passed it, I had to fight the urge to open it. And every time I'd remind myself that I wasn't crazy. That door shouldn't even be there. It wasn't long before things began to get strange. I had locked the door that night, the same way I had found it, but every morning it would be open again. Not just slightly ajar, but wide open, as if someone had been in the room. I would close it again, check the lock, and make sure it was secure, but the same thing would happen the next day. No matter how many times I locked it, no matter how careful I was, the door would open. One evening, after coming home from work, I walked into the house and immediately noticed the door was open once again, but this time there was a faint sound coming from inside the room. It was a soft scratching noise, like fingernails against wood. I froze, my heart racing, and stood at the entrance of the hallway, too scared to move. The scratching continued, louder now, as if whatever was in there was trying to get out. I knew I had to investigate, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave. I turned to leave the house, but something compelled me to step closer. The door was wide open, the blackness inside like a void calling me. With a shaking hand, I reached out and touched the doorframe, but as soon as my fingers made contact, the scratching stopped. I stood there, motionless, trying to gather my courage. Something was in that room, something that didn't want to be found, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the door itself, this locked, unexplainable door, was the key to whatever was haunting me. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside again. The air was cold, colder than I remembered, and the darkness was thick, pressing in on me. The room was exactly the same as before, empty, featureless, a room that shouldn't exist. But this time, something had changed. In the center of the room, a small object sat on the floor. It was a key. I stared at it for a long time, unsure of what to make of it. The key looked old, rusted, as though it had been there for years, but I didn't remember it being there before. It seemed out of place, like it belonged to something, or someone other than the house. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and as soon as I touched the key, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through my fingers. I pulled my hand back, staring at the key in shock. It was warm now, almost alive, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I couldn't explain it, but I knew this key had something to do with the room, with the door, with whatever was trying to stay locked inside. I turned around to leave, but as I did, I heard the door creak close behind me. I hadn't touched it. The door had simply shut on its own, and I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't open again. It was as if the house had decided that I had gone far enough, that I had uncovered something it wasn't ready to reveal. I left that night, abandoning everything I had started to build in that house. The key, the door, the room, it all stayed behind, locked away in the shadows of that place. I don't know what I found in that room or what was truly behind that door, but I know this: some locks should never be opened and some rooms should never be entered. Because once you do, there's no turning back. When I first moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street, I had no idea what I was in for. The house was beautiful, with its grand staircase and intricate woodwork, but there was something unsettling about it. The air always seemed heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I could never quite shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even when I was the only one there. It wasn't the kind of house you could just move into without asking questions. It had been on the market for a long time, and I had gotten it for a steal, but the realtor's reluctance to talk about the house's past raised my suspicions. She was quick to mention how charming the house was and how well it had been maintained, but when I asked about its history, she changed the subject. I should have listened to my gut, but I was too excited to be in a new place. The first few nights were quiet. I unpacked, explored the rooms, and tried to make the house feel like home. But then things began to change. I started hearing sounds in the middle of the night, footsteps, creaking floorboards, and the occasional distant whisper. I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to the old house settling, but as the days went by, the sounds grew louder and more frequent. It was as though someone or something was walking around the house when no one was there. One night, I woke up to a loud bang from upstairs. My heart raced as I lay in bed, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or the house shifting. But then, I heard a low, guttural moan, followed by a muffled scream. I bolted upright, my breath coming in short gasps. The scream was faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of someone in pain, someone calling for help. But the strange thing was, there was no one else in the house. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but when I looked around, the house was completely still. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear anything, but the sound had stopped. I thought maybe I had imagined it, so I tried to go back to sleep, but every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of wind outside kept me awake. The next day, I decided to investigate. I went upstairs to the room where I had heard the scream, but there was nothing there. No sign of a struggle, no disturbances on the floor, no windows open to explain the strange sounds. I checked every room, every closet, and even the attic, but it was all the same, quiet, undisturbed, and empty. But the house wasn't done with me yet. As the days passed, the strange occurrences continued. The noises got worse, whispers in the dark, the feeling of being watched, and most disturbingly, the feeling that I was being followed through the house. Every time I turned a corner, I'd catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting out of sight, or a movement where there shouldn't be any. But when I looked directly, there was nothing. It wasn't long before I started having vivid dreams about the house. In these dreams, I was walking through the hallways, but they weren't the same hallways I knew. They were dark, suffocating, and twisted, with doors that led to places that shouldn't have existed. In every dream, I would hear that scream again, the same one from the night I woke up, only now it was louder, closer, and filled with desperation. I began to lose sleep, plagued by these dreams and the constant unease that hung over me. I thought about leaving, but something kept me there. Maybe it was the house's strange pull, or maybe I was too stubborn to admit I was scared. Either way, I decided to dig deeper into the house's history. After some research, I discovered the house's dark past. The house had once been the home of a wealthy family, but tragedy struck when the youngest child of the family went missing. The child's disappearance was never solved, and the family was said to have been driven mad by the loss, with whispers of strange happenings and eerie sounds in the house. Over time, the house was abandoned, left to decay as rumors of its haunted history spread. But none of that explained the scream I had heard, or the feeling that something or someone was still trapped inside. Determined to uncover the truth, I began to look into the missing child. I found an old journal from the child's mother, detailing the pain and despair of losing her daughter. As I read the journal, I realized that the screams I had been hearing were not just echoes of the past. They were the cries of the lost child, the child who had never been found. One evening, I decided to return to the room where the scream had come from. This time I was prepared. I didn't expect to find answers, but I felt that I had to confront whatever was in that house, whatever was causing the disturbances. I stood in the center of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, and called out. I asked if anyone was there, if anyone needed help. The room was deathly silent. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. For a moment, I thought maybe I had finally imagined it all, that I had convinced myself of something that wasn't real. But just as I was about to leave, I heard it again, a soft whisper, followed by a guttural sob. I froze, my mind racing. The voice wasn't human, not in the way I understood it. It was something older, something broken. It wasn't a cry for help, but rather the sound of someone lost, unable to find their way out. It was the voice of a child, but not one who had ever been found. I spent the next few hours in the room, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The sobs grew louder, and then, for a brief moment, everything went still. In that silence, I felt a shift in the air, a weight, a release. I knew, in that moment, that the child's spirit had finally found peace. Whether it was my presence or simply the passing of time, the house had let go of its sorrow. I left that night, never to return to that house again. The door creaked as I closed it behind me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of finality, as if the house had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. I don't know what happened to the child or why the house had been haunted for so long, but I do know this: some houses carry with them the weight of unresolved pain and the silent screams of those who never had the chance to cry for help. I left Elm Street behind, but the echoes of the house and the child would stay with me forever. The first time I encountered the door, I didn't think much of it. It was just another door in the old farmhouse where I had been living for a few weeks, trying to get away from the chaos of city life. The house, built in the early 1900s, had a charm about it: creaky floors, antique furniture, and that unmistakable smell of aged wood and dust. It was quiet, peaceful, and just what I needed. The door was tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway that led to a part of the house I hadn't explored much. It was painted a dull gray, the same color as the walls surrounding it, making it easy to miss. At first glance, it appeared to be a closet or perhaps a storage room, but there was something off about it. For one, it didn't have a handle, just a small knob that barely seemed to fit into the frame. It looked as though it hadn't been opened in years, maybe even decades. Curiosity got the better of me one afternoon as I wandered through the house. I had already checked out most of the rooms, and I was eager to explore this one last mystery. The knob, which looked like it hadn't been touched in ages, was oddly warm to the touch when I turned it. I wondered briefly if it was just the heat of the house seeping through, but that didn't explain why the door creaked as if it hadn't moved in a long time. When the door swung open, I was greeted by an odd sight: a small, empty room. The walls were bare, the floor was covered in dust, and there was a faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. But what struck me most was the air itself. It felt wrong. Cold, thick, like the room was suffocating under the weight of something unspoken. It was unlike any other room in the house. Everything else felt natural, if not a bit worn down. But this room felt out of place. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just an old, unused part of the house. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Why was the door hidden at the end of the hall, and why had it been locked for so long? I decided to leave it alone for the time being, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. It felt like there was something I wasn't supposed to know about that room, like the house was hiding something from me. Days passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about the room. Every time I walked past the door, I could feel a chill creeping over me. It wasn't the temperature of the house, but something in the air that seemed to emanate from that specific spot. It was as if the room itself was calling to me, urging me to open the door again, to step inside. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. One evening, after dinner, I found myself standing in front of the door once again. My heart raced in my chest as I reached for the knob, feeling the familiar warmth under my fingers. This time, when I opened the door, the room was different. The dust was gone, and the walls were no longer bare. In their place were faded, peeling wallpaper designs, strange patterns I hadn't seen before. The room, once empty, now had furniture: an old rocking chair in one corner, a table with a chipped vase, and a small bed with a threadbare quilt thrown across it. The air in the room was thick and musty, but there was something else now, something that felt wrong. I stepped inside, my curiosity outweighing my hesitation. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the house. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the door was locked. No knob, no handle, just an empty, dark wood frame. I was trapped. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck as I paced around the room, searching for another way out. There was no window, no other door. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I felt a pressure on my chest, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. I tried not to panic, but the oppressive atmosphere in the room made it hard to breathe. And then I saw it. In the corner, near the bed, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark figure that seemed to shift with the flickering light from the dim bulb above. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it more clearly. It was a figure, but not like a person. It was something darker, something not quite human. Its shape was distorted, its features blurry, and yet I could feel its presence, like it was staring right through me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. The room seemed to grow colder, the walls closing in tighter, and I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a place where time didn't exist. It wasn't until I turned back toward the door that I saw it, the doorknob. It had appeared while I wasn't looking, glowing faintly with a soft, almost ethereal light. I rushed to it, desperate to escape, but as my hand grasped the knob, it twisted violently, and the door flung open. The room was gone. The bed, the furniture, the shadow, everything vanished in an instant. I was standing in the same hallway, with the same dull gray door in front of me. It looked just as it had when I first found it, untouched, unchanged, but I knew something had shifted. That room, that locked door, it wasn't just a hidden part of the house. It was something far more sinister. I left the farmhouse not long after that night, unable to shake the feeling that some presence was still there, waiting for me. I don't know if the room ever existed outside of my mind, or if the house truly was hiding something from me. But I do know that I'll never forget the door that shouldn't have opened, and the room that was never supposed to exist. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some rooms are meant to remain locked, and some things are better left untouched. The house had always felt a bit off, but I had attributed it to the usual quirks of an old property. The creaking floors, the drafts through the walls, the peculiar smell of forgotten rooms, it all felt oddly familiar in a way that made me feel at home. After all, it was an old Victorian house, purchased at a price too good to pass up. It was meant to be a fixer-upper, and I was eager to restore it to its former glory. However, there was one room that never seemed right. I had never noticed it when I first walked through the house, but after I moved in and began exploring, I came across a door tucked at the very end of a narrow hallway. It was strange, much smaller than the other doors in the house, almost as if it was an afterthought. The door was solid, painted a faded green that blended with the walls. No handle, no knob, just a faint outline that made it look like part of the wall itself. I tried to open it the first time I noticed it, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, though there was no key to be found. I thought it was a strange detail, but I didn't dwell on it. There were other rooms in the house that needed attention, and I had plenty to keep me busy. But over the following weeks, the door seemed to call to me. It wasn't a physical pull, nothing tangible. It was more of an itch in the back of my mind, an unease that I couldn't shake. I would walk past it in the hall, and the hairs on the back of my neck would rise. The house felt quiet around that door, as if something inside was holding its breath, waiting for me to come back and open it. It wasn't until one stormy night that I found myself in front of it again. The wind howled outside, and the rain lashed against the windows, creating an oppressive atmosphere. I stood in the hallway staring at the door when I noticed something odd. The knob. It was turning ever so slightly, as if someone or something was on the other side trying to get in. I had to admit, it terrified me, but curiosity won out. With trembling hands, I reached for the knob and twisted it. To my surprise, the door opened with a creak, revealing a room that shouldn't have existed. The space was unlike anything I had expected. It wasn't just a dusty old closet or an unused storage area like I had assumed. It was a full room, though it was much smaller than the others in the house. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and a single bulb in the center of the ceiling flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air in the room was thick and musty, but there was something else, a palpable heaviness that seemed to settle in the air, almost as if the room had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The room was empty, save for a small wooden table in the center and an old armchair in the corner. The table was covered with a thick layer of dust, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. But what caught my attention was the mirror on the far wall. It wasn't like any mirror I'd seen before. The glass was tinted with a dark, almost amber hue, and the frame was intricately carved, adorned with strange symbols I couldn't quite decipher. I moved closer to the mirror, feeling a strange pull toward it. The air grew colder as I neared it, and my breath became visible in the dim light. I stared at my reflection, but something was off. My face looked distorted, like it was shifting in and out of focus. I reached out a hand, and for a brief moment the reflection didn't mirror my movement. Instead, the figure in the mirror stood still, staring back at me with eyes that weren't my own. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. But when I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. My breath quickened, and panic set in. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing inward as though they were alive, suffocating me. I ran to the window, but there was no escape. It wasn't even a window at all. It was a solid wall. I frantically turned around, looking for an exit, but the room had shifted. The door was gone. In its place was the mirror, standing tall and reflective, as if mocking my futile attempts to leave. I sank to the floor, my head spinning. How had the room changed? Was I losing my mind, or was this place alive? Minutes or maybe hours passed before I could gather enough strength to rise. I turned back to the mirror, and this time the reflection was clearer. The face staring back at me was mine, but something was different. It wasn't just the eyes, it was the expression. The figure in the mirror was smiling, a grin that stretched too wide, as if the reflection had taken on a life of its own. I bolted for the door, this time throwing my shoulder into it with all my might. The door creaked open, and I stumbled out of the room, gasping for air. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands shaking uncontrollably. That was the last time I ever opened that door. I don't know what happened in that room, and I don't think I want to know. The house feels different now, quieter, as if it's waiting for me to make another mistake. I avoid that hallway, and I've never gone near the door again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside and the house settles, I swear I hear it. A faint scratching, a low whisper, like something or someone is trying to get out. I've sealed the door shut now, hidden it beneath layers of wallpaper and paint. But I know that it's still there, waiting for someone else to open it. A room that doesn't belong in this house, a door that shouldn't exist, and a reflection that will never stop smiling. There was something.